Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Cate Heaney. I'm the Wellness Coordinator for Relationship Education and Violence Prevention in the Student Wellness Center. I use she, her, and her pronouns. And we are here today with our panelists discussing rape culture and consent culture and how we can really make that shift between the two. So I do want to say straight up, again, we are going to be talking about rape and sexual assault and other types of gender-based violence. And we understand that can be really, really difficult. So I do want everybody to know that if you need to take a step back, maybe pause us, or even just turn us off, that's totally okay. We want you to take care of yourselves and do whatever feels best and feels good for you, okay? So like I said, my name's Cate. I'm the Wellness Coordinator for Violence Prevention in the Student Wellness Center, and I really want to introduce our panelists here. So Mia, let's start with you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mia Cariello. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a third year studying women's gender and sexuality studies, and I am currently the president of Take Back the Night here at OSU.
Hi everyone, my name is Madison Eagle. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the intercultural specialist for women's student initiatives in the Student Life Multicultural Center. I have a master's degree in social work, and I also identify as an Indigenous woman, which informs my perspective on this topic.
Oh, that's me. I'm sorry, I forgot about the order. My name is Emily Gemar. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the campus advocacy coordinator with Ohio Health SARNCO, which is the Sexual Assault Response Network of Central Ohio. And I'm actually based on OSU's Columbus campus. So I provide direct services and support to all survivors of sexual violence, really anybody who has an affiliation to the campus.
Hi everyone, my name is Cate Hawkins. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a graduating senior in the social work program here at OSU. I'm also the acting president of It's On Us, which is a campaign to end sexual assault on college campuses. And I'm also finishing up a senior research thesis with women who are survivors of sexual violence at OSU. So it's been a really interesting and intriguing experience that I'd like to share.
Well, welcome to all of our panelists. I have to say, I am so excited to have you all here. I think we have some really great perspectives on this topic. So with that being said, let's just jump right into it. We'll start at the beginning. So what is rape culture? How would you define it?
To me, I think rape culture is sort of the prevalence of normalizing and also minimizing survivors of sexual violence's experiences, but also like the act of sexual violence itself. So just seeing it sort of like in like on social media or like on TV, just like sort of thrown in there as like a minor plot point, I think also like makes it really hard to combat rape culture. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I would also add, like, I think it can be very subtle as well. It's very integrated into the ways that we exist as a society. And oftentimes when we think about rape, we think of like this perpetrator and this like violent person who's a stranger and going to attack you from the bushes or something. But it's really like more often the language that we use in everyday conversations. It's the media that we are consuming. It's the perspectives that we see online and in friendships and in professional relationships even. And so I think it can be conflated into a boogeyman scenario when really it's much more pervasive than that.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and building on that, I agree. It definitely exists in all areas of our culture. It certainly creates an environment for lots of violence and abuse to occur. I would also add that a lot of what rape culture does that's so horrible is that it allows us to internalize these messages, whether we're conscious of it or not. So a lot of times when someone does experience an incident of sexual violence, they internalize these messages about who a victim is or should be, who a perpetrator is or could be. Like Madison said, we're kind of fed this myth that the perpetrator is always a stranger in a scary situation that would be very alarming. But it's much more likely, research has shown for many, many years, it's much more likely to be somebody that you know, that you have a personal connection to, and that has access to your personal life.
Yeah, I just second everything that everyone said. You really summed it up well. I think that idea of the absence of consent is really important. That's not something that we're taught to really get from people in any part of our lives. Yeah. And I guess, yeah, it's just that idea that sexual violence and the violation of bodily autonomy, like we're supposed to accept that as a norm. And that's what keeps rape culture going. And it's really important you all mentioned that it's not just on a micro level, it's not just conversations, it's also structural. And to sum that kind of up in a little bit, we've all been talking about that idea of rape script theory, that if your perpetrator didn't use force, if you knew them, that it's not considered sexual assault. And this is a perfect time to bring up this quote from one of the participants in my study about this idea of rape script. And so this woman said, "I think that there's such a stigma that if you're not in an alleyway getting raped by some random person who you don't know, it's not a crime or it's not sexual violence, but it was." And I think that sums that up really perfectly.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, this is something that we see often, that script of it has to be a stranger in the bushes, and we know that's not true. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And you know, something that I think I heard the word norm, I think, out of all of your answers, which I love. And that actually kind of leads us into our next question. So the phrase rape culture is so simple, right? It's only 2 words, but it's really, really impactful. And what I think stands out to me is that culture part, that norm part, which really implies that rape culture affects every part of our lives. And Madison, I think you said this too. So where and how do you see rape culture being perpetrated?
I think I see it most in like everyday sort of discussions, including like interpersonal relationships with like family or friends, sort of just like that always like impeding like idea that, oh, you have to protect yourselves because you're always at risk of getting raped, at least from a woman identifying point of view. That's how I've experienced rape culture so prevalently in my life. So a lot of my family members would just be like, oh, like make sure you're going out with like either like your girlfriend or like go to the bathroom like together. And it was a very interesting thing because it comes from a place of love. Like they're trying to protect you, but simultaneously it's that always like fear of getting raped that's promoting this sort of like caution. And that's sort of like the biggest, I guess, like evidence that rape culture is so prevalent in our society, just because at least with all of like my women identifying friends, all of us have experienced some sort of this sort of love caution relationship that might be reinforcing stereotypes of victimhood. Like, oh, like if you didn't wear that, like you wouldn't get like harassed, or like if you didn't go there at that time, then you wouldn't get attacked. So sort of like that like complicated like relationship that you have with sort of like your body and then with others and then other people with your body is very like, I don't know, I think it's like so pervasive just because so many of my friends have gone through those same like cautionary tales. I don't know what Maddie thinks, but I'll pass it to her.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the like commonality of it. Like, I don't know anyone who doesn't have a story. No one, from my family to my friends to strangers that I just randomly meet. Every woman that I know has a story, and a lot of men also have stories. And non-binary folks too, everyone. It's so pervasive in our society. And so when I think of rape culture, I really think of a cycle of violence, right? How are we socializing our communities and our families and our children to reinforce these norms, to limit accountability for people who may commit acts of violence or assault in the future. I really think of especially the socialization of men, not that all men are perpetrators or that it's only men that are perpetrators, but predominantly we know from statistics that it is, majoritatively. And so I really think about, how are we raising young men? Are we teaching them to be good people? Are we teaching them about consent? Are we holding them accountable when they violate other people's safety and consent? And that's something that's really on my mind right now. And if anybody hasn't seen it, please watch The Mask You Live In. Highly, highly recommend, just to get like a perspective of what men have to go through to be socialized and to put on a mask, and the expectations that are on them to continue this cycle of violence.
Yes, I agree with all of that. Very well said, Madison. I think it's so interesting when we look at like where rape culture shows up, and where it's being perpetrated. Because I agree. Mia had a really excellent point about a lot of it comes from may come from a good place, of people wanting to be protective over the people they care about. But a lot of it is like really unexamined and false. So we have these instincts to protect people, and we kind of continue to spread these rape culture myths, but we don't really know all the time why. I always mention when I train on rape culture at Sarnco, I always mention, like my dad or my brother's handing me like mace or something, and I'm like, why do I need this? And they're like, well, because you're a girl and stuff could happen to you. And they weren't really examining like, well, what were they envisioning could happen to me? Like, why did I need that protective material, but my brothers didn't, and other members of my family didn't. And so it's really, I think it spreads so pervasively, and it shows up in so many places because we just don't question it. And I also want to touch on the lack of education piece that Maddie brought up, is like, we just don't educate our children, particularly in this country, about sex or consent or what our bodies do, or like the right we all have to bodily autonomy. So all of those are aspects of, I think, probably consent culture, but we don't educate or give even consistent education on any of those topics. So of course, I think that creates an environment where rape culture festers and it shows up, and it allows things for, toxic masculinity to be socialized into like young men and boys and get worse.
Great points, everyone. Yeah. When I think of this question, I think of it in the context of, what I've been doing for the last 4 years. So it's college, and where is rape culture perpetuated at school? And the biggest place where I see it is in the party culture. And I guess that's kind of to be expected, sexual assault and substance use often go hand in hand. But it's just really intriguing to me that we place all this emphasis on the importance of the social aspect of going out and drinking with your friends. What comes with that is this idea that alcohol is the norm in sexual experiences, or substance use is the norm in sexual experiences. So it's better if you're a guy and this girl's really drunk, because that means she's definitely going to put out, my French. But it's that idea, right? Like, so, I have been almost kind of disgusted by these things that I've seen. And it's in a social environment, and you think that with what we're talking about, right, these ideas that women have to protect each other and you can't leave your friends alone and all this stuff, why do we allow alcohol to be even more of a deterrent from consent? Because it is, and it's just something really important to think about. Once you put in a substance use into these situations, how much more disastrous it can be, and how we genuinely overlook that a lot because there's underage drinking involved when it comes to a college context and all those things. So
I have a point I want to share because I really love Nikaila's answer. But it popped into my head as soon as you started talking, because I also had wanted to share like another place where I think rape culture shows up a lot that we don't think about, and that's intimate partner relationships. A lot of times what I've been seeing a lot in the campus community, and just over my, I think, career as an advocate, has been a lot of really unhealthy behaviors and like expectations that exist in a relationship because we socialize people. I mean, it's really like the history of the world, you know. A lot of times like we've been socialized that our partners, like we have some kind of ownership or control over them. Mm-hmm. And that's really not the case, and that there needs to be this power imbalance in a relationship, especially if it's not if you know, like somebody makes more money or if somebody has access to more resources, that there needs to be this power imbalance, and that one person needs to be, you know, more in control than the other one. And obviously that translates into every aspect of the relationship, including sex and sexual relationships. And so I've seen a lot of rape culture showing up in relationships with, you know, like really like degrading behaviors towards your partner, like really awful like rape culture jokes that we would hear in other settings, but being used in a partnership. Like of course, like victim blaming, perpetuating a cycle of being in an abusive relationship. I'll stop there.
All great points.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I actually want to talk real quick about something that Nikayla had said that kind of popped into my mind. It was about how alcohol it seemed to be the norm in sexual experiences. And it brought me back to a conversation that I was having with one of my students a few weeks ago about a particular show that it's been described as the new version of Friends, being How I Met Your Mother, and and how one character, it's like his entire thing in the show is trying to pick up women at bars by getting them drunk and doing all this weird stuff. And I know it's ridiculous, right? But you know what's funny is something that my student had said was that, you know, I don't think I realized what was actually happening and the impact that was having until I was an adult. And by that time it had, you know, that show had already kind of taken a hold of everything, and that had kind of already framed our thoughts. So I'm kind of interested, do you all have or have you seen anything like that, whether it be a show, I don't know, music or anything like that kind of made you take a step back and go, whoa, wait a second, yikes, the message that this is sending is really terrible?
I think that's a very common theme. There's always the player, the guy who's the player who his whole character is picking up women, mm-hmm. or enticing them into coming back to hang out with them, to whatever it is. Yeah, that's definitely a common archetype.
Yeah. And it's really common for, I think, those types of characters to like brag or be really proud about like using alcohol as some sort of, like, I know it's often referred to as like a social lubricant, which is awful. I hate it when people say that, so I apologize for saying it now. Or, you know, you even have like musicians and other people like actively bragging about like drugging someone and sexually assaulting them in lyrics. And so I know Barney Stinson is the character you were talking about. I think it's such an awful example, and it's so awful. Sorry, my dog is now demanding that. He's like, Barney Stinson, I don't like that name. But I think what's so awful about Barney Stinson and How I Met Your Mother is that he was like this goal for all men. All of the men that I knew that watched that show like wanted to be him. They thought he was so cool, and it's like played for comedic effect, mm-hmm. but it was always so shocking to me how like I always kind of saw the comedy aspect of it, that it wasn't always taken very seriously. But other people were like, no, it's serious. Like he's who I want to be. He gets all these girls. And I've actually been rewatching it to update my rape culture presentation that I do to get some material, because it's full of material. And then you have all of these alcohol ads that I know I mentioned this, and I know Cate's seen it in my rape culture presentation. I use the Belvedere vodka ads that are very, very shocking for me to see, because it's, some of them are like, look like they're actually, a man is actually perpetrating a sexual assault on a woman, and it'll have like a tagline like Belvedere always goes down smoothly. And it's just kind of, again, like, I think those are like key examples of rape culture in media, in advertisements, that are just kind of perpetuating this idea that we need to use alcohol, we need to use force. Being a player, getting the girl is your ultimate end goal, no matter the cost.
Yeah. There's like two things that I really remember just being like, oh wait, time out. This is like really freaky. One was I forgot his name, the blurred lines guy, Diggle. I don't remember his name. That might not actually be his name. But yeah, his like blurred lines was definitely like a moment where I was just like, wait, is he actually saying what I think he's saying? And then like the fact that people were just playing it everywhere, like, and there was a lot of backlash, but the fact that people continue just playing it, just like, all right, this is okay. I think he played at like some big music award show, and I was just like, this is why, like, I am so confused as to why anyone let this happen. But then I was also thinking back on like really early like Kesha music, like really early, like blah blah blah, where it was sort of like, I'm trying to think, because I'm trying to get back into like the early 2000s, like I guess like memory, but exactly what that song said. But I just remember like a lot of the songs that she put out earlier, which now I think are complicated because of her issue with her producer and like that sort of like sexual assault allegations and all of that, definitely like made me rethink about a lot about what music that she was sort of like forced to put out. And blah 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 definitely was one where I was like, oh, like she's actually just invalidating like this guy's autonomy. Like she's just like, just give me your dick. Sorry, that's like a little like bold, but like that's sort of what she's saying in the song. But it was just really interesting that was sort of like, when I think back on it, I'm like, clearly this is an issue. But when I was younger, I was like, oh yeah, this is just a song. Like there's clearly nothing wrong with it. But like how insidious, like really catchy, like music just has us like, oh yeah, this is totally okay. But those two were really big in my mind. I don't know why Kesha's blah 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 stuck out, but I think it was more of just like her whole like issue with her producer being really slimy. So
yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's fascinating, like when we're talking about media, like a lot of the examples that come to mind are like pre #MeToo. And I think there's really been a media shift. Like there's so many, I feel like, great TV right now, like Sex Education and Pen 15 and Big Mouth, that are like head on, like addressing these awkward like things that like before, like 5 years ago, 3 years ago, would have been unheard of for these shows to be so popular. And they're really addressing these issues like, oh, like these are normal things, and like addressing sex in a way that's accessible not only to like adults but to younger folks too, who may only have exposure through unsavory means, like that they don't really know. So I just find the evolution of media, like especially with Me Too, so fascinating and encouraging, that like if we're here now, how much further can we go? Like I really think it can only get better.
Yeah, and that's, so your point actually brings up something really interesting. The NSBRC does a 30 days of Sam Instagram challenge every year, And actually tomorrow's prompt for the Instagram challenge is when pop culture gets it right. And it's to share your favorite positive examples of consent from pop culture, including TV shows, movies, books, music, and more. So hopefully we'll see some really good stuff and have, get a better or more comprehensive list of things where pop culture does get it right. So we're not stuck rewatching How I Met Your Mother for the 15th time. So cool. Thank you. All right. So moving on, clearly rape culture definitely manifests in so many different ways in a lot of different spaces too. So what do you think are the defining characteristics of rape culture? So in other words, how can we recognize rape culture?
I think recognizing rape culture definitely takes a lot of self-reflection, just because the things that we sort of mentioned before, which is like, how a lot of like interpersonal relationships with like family sort of reproduce these like rape myths, but also like you're self-internalizing that. I think recognizing where like you can catch yourself being like, I wonder like what she was doing there, like those sort of like things that we have been sort of socialized to assume that we should ask. I think that is part of recognizing rape culture, when you're like, wait, do I actually need to know all of these details of someone's experience, or do I just need to be there for them? I think is a really important way to recognize it, just because self-checking is as important as trying to check someone else.
I think for me, one of the wonderful things about aging and growing and becoming more of an adult is being able to trust my gut and being able to be like, I see that behavior and this is not acceptable to me, and these are the reasons why. Whereas in the past, I have doubted myself, like, I'm being really judgmental right now. Like, I need to take a step back and like questioning myself. But I've really given that up. It's not for me. I listened to this podcast called My Favorite Murder, and one of their catchphrases is F politeness.
Yes.
And so I really think that just encapsulates, like, as women, we are like programmed and socialized to doubt ourselves and to question whether what's happening is our fault or not, and that sort of thing. And I really think like building that confidence in young women is so important. Like, no, like, this is wrong and you have every right to say that it's wrong and address it. So that's really what stands out for me.
Yeah, those are great answers. I think I agree. I think a lot of it is like self-reflection and being aware of where you're at. I always really encourage people to like think about how they're doing consent, and like how are you talking about that with your partners? Like, are you talking about it? Because if you're not, there's probably an issue. And I always like encourage people to check in and like see like what has your history with your partners been like how have you been communicating and interacting, because that I think is a big red, yellow, or green flag, or a combination of those, to kind of tell you how, like, where you're at and what you're doing. But I also think, like, being tuned into when jokes are made at the expense of somebody's identity or an experience they've had, and really being intentional about, like, I probably shouldn't ever be laughing at a traumatic experience or at an aspect of somebody's identity. So I always encourage people, like, because I think that's where it shows up a lot, is like jokes and put downs and trying to make something seem like it's not as serious as it is, like a lot of that minimization game. trying to like minimize and deny somebody's experience or who they are. And so I think I encourage people to check in on those areas to see how they're doing on the self-awareness level scale.
Great points, everyone. Yeah, I don't have much to add. I guess what I do personally, and along with that self-reflection piece, which everyone mentioned, I think is really important, is really identifying when, because I think it happens a lot. I think a lot of rape culture is shifted in those interpersonal experiences with your friends, with your peers, colleagues, whatever. And just noticing when there's a lack of consent or disregard for consent in any situation. You know, we're talking in the context of sexual consent, but if you know there's someone in your life who disregards the consent of people all the time, like Emily said, to me, that's a big flag. That's a big red flag. And yeah, and just holding people accountable for consent in every way of life, because I feel like it has to start somewhere for someone to grow into others of their lives.
And I would just add like check in with like, what are you engaging with too? Mm-hmm. Like I know a big part of this Me Too reckoning for everyone is like, maybe there is like some artist or some form of art that you have a deep attachment to. And it's been really hard to hear that they've caused harm and trauma to others. And that's difficult. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people like have musical artists that maybe like have formed a very important part of their life, or they're, you know, like is a director or an actor whose work has been very meaningful to you. But I think and I can only really speak for myself, but part of Me Too has been saying goodbye to some of those things, because I can't really engage with it anymore and also be an advocate for survivors. That's personally for me. And it's not always as black and white as I made it sound for me. Sometimes it's more of an area of gray. But really look at like, what am I actively engaging with and then supporting in a way? And like, what am I accepting of?
Yeah, I would like to add on like Emily's like point. I feel like it is really hard. I've seen like a lot of my friends struggle with like having to deal with their favorite artists being like just like very like much accused in the public forum and on Twitter. And they sometimes don't handle it as gracefully as you would think they would, considering like they don't really have any like personal attachment to that except that they're consuming their content. Mm-hmm. A lot of the things that I've helped me and also helped a lot of my friends with, one of my teachers was talking about how all of us can sort of have these problematic faves. Like, yes, like liking X, Y, and Z is problematic, and we have to acknowledge that they're problematic. But it doesn't like negate that like, oh, you once found joy in this music before you found out that all of this was happening. So it's sort of like being able to recognize that, yes, these people are problematic, and should you really fund their endeavors anymore? Probably not. But also trying to balance this like guilty pleasure, but also trying to recognize that it's a problematic one. So sort of just like combining them as a problematic fave sort of addresses it and sort of tells people that you're like, this is bad, and I'm trying to like not engage with it as much, but it definitely is like a stepping stone, and sometimes that's the only stone that people will get, but it's definitely better than people like vehemently defending sexual violence on Twitter. I think it's just better if they just acknowledge it and then sort of like slowly like phase out, or even just like slowly stop trying to defend them, because that makes it really traumatic for everyone who has to engage with them as a person too, because if they're defending the person that they've never really met, I feel like people might get the wrong impression that they also wouldn't support friends who are survivors. Mm-hmm. So it's a very delicate dance, I think, for people.
Absolutely. I was going to add on to that. Everything y'all said has been great. On the other hand of that, like, I think that, and this is a personal opinion, that people who acknowledge the wrongdoings that they've done and are actively working to correct them in some way deserve redemption. And if you have a problematic fave who has effed up in a lot of ways in the past, whether it's with racism or xenophobia or sexual assault, misogyny, whatever it is, that like if you made a mistake, you would want that too. But you know, people show over and over again that if they have wealth and fame and status, that it doesn't really matter to them to correct their behavior. So it's like Mia said, it's that delicate dance of of like, how are you idolizing people, and how are you contending with the consequences if someone's morals or their actions don't line up with yours? And you really do have to deal with that on a personal level.
That's what I was gonna bring up too, is like that idea of cancel culture and like just cutting people out. Like if we really do that, everyone is problematic. Like everyone, including myself, like I have my own biases. I have my things that happen that I've just been socialized to do. And yes, I'm maybe able to be more self-aware because of my education background, because of the experiences that I've had. But that doesn't mean that I don't still have work to do. And one of the tenets of social work that I really love is called cultural humility, and just acknowledging that like we all have room to grow constantly, and we all have a dedication and expectation, I think, for humanity that we should all try and do better. And yeah.
Yeah, I really like that point about cultural humility, right? Yeah. I think it's really important to sort of like acknowledge people's ability to grow. Not saying that you have to forgive anyone and everyone for their wrongdoings, but definitely like you yourself can grow, and like if you think someone has the potential to grow also, I feel like this is a really important thing to keep in mind, so you can continue to grow with them if you want to keep them in your life or not.
Yeah. All really, really great points. This is a great conversation, y'all. I'm very happy about this. But I do want to move on to our next question, which might actually continue this part of the conversation. So do you think rape culture looks different in different communities? And if so, how?
I think the answer is that rape culture looks different, yes, in different communities, but at its core, it's still the same. So like sort of minimizing the impact of like sexual violence and abuse while simultaneously not really regarding survivors as legitimate like victims, or just like, oh, it's no big deal, sort of minimizing that experience. But I feel like in different communities, and especially different cultural contexts, like that is presented differently and for different reasons. So like I guess like in the APITA community, I feel like it's like, oh, like you don't talk about that, so you don't sort of like bring dishonor on your family, or sort of just like a type of like, oh, that's taboo, like we don't talk about that. And I feel like that's been a very like interesting thing to sort of grapple with, the differences in culture, and how like, oh, like from my perspective, I'm like, oh, that's clearly like not okay. But also like me looking at that from an outsider perspective and into it, is really hard to sort of pinpoint my own culture biases. Like, oh, that's just what my parents say to protect me. Like that sort of like, I guess like interpersonal like blindness. Like you can't really see it, like you have blinders on, like you can only see like other people's cultural faults. And I guess that sort of ties back into Maddie's term, like cultural humility, sort of like seeing other people's culture and also being like, wait, I also need to self-reflect on like what my culture is telling me that I have to do. So I think in that way they're all very different, but I still think in a way they're also very similar, because they have like sort of the same core goal, which is to minimize survivors.
When I think about this question, like I really reflect on my own Indigenous communities and the historical oppression and colonization that we have experienced, and how that influences these conversations on violence and rape culture. 4 in 5 American Indian Indigenous women will experience some kind of violence in their life, and 50% of Indigenous women will experience sexual violence in particular. It's one of the highest statistics for one particular community. And there's a lot of internal conversations happening about like, why is this happening? What's going on? And a lot of it has to do with that systemic violence, that institutional oppression, the disenfranchisement of communities, the high levels of poverty, and other issues that contribute to that perpetuation and that cycle of violence again. And a lot of other conversations happening are particularly about toxic masculinity for Native and Indigenous men in particular. There's a lot of conversations about how Indigenous men often feel powerless and disenfranchised themselves because they can't live in a traditional way because we are so impoverished and marginalized. And so that is a symptom of this cycle, is that because they feel disenfranchised as men and not being able to be who they were meant to be or to practice traditional ways, then it comes out in these other ways of violence and other abuses. So I think there's a lot of positive things happening, but as far as addressing these issues and having these conversations, there's a really good documentary called Rape on the Reservation that really highlights this issue and the intricacies of tribal law versus state and federal law, and how that in turn further marginalizes and oppresses Indigenous people experiencing these types of violence.
Yeah, great point.
Mm-hmm.
When I was thinking about this question, I was kind of thinking about like ableism and mental illness, and how that is such a big part already of how we sometimes view any survivor who comes forward with an experience of sexual violence. They're often labeled, and I think this is a big symptom of rape culture, they're often labeled as crazy or insane. Mm-hmm. And so I think when we suggest that a victim survivor may be insane or crazy for coming forward, we're kind of perpetuating ableism and rape culture, and we're kind of using ableism to justify violence and blame the victim survivor. I think there are also times when we're discussing like survivors with disabilities that we kind of we have these assumptions that they're incapable of giving or denying consent either way, and when we make those assumptions too, we're kind of denying that person's like agency and bodily autonomy, and we're just kind of presuming that they may be like, we're presuming incompetence, that they can't make those decisions for themselves. And I think there are also times when survivors with disabilities don't speak or have been rendered like temporarily incapable of producing speech. And that's, very silencing, like another symptom, like it silences survivors. And I think it really delegitimizes survivors. I don't think I said that right. But just going back to kind of this idea that survivors are insane or crazy, I think when we're especially talking about survivors who may have like pre-existing like mental health issues or like a psychiatric disability, we're kind of rendering like their experience as meaningless and minimizing it. And so I just think, we often like throw these words around when we're talking about survivors that people are like escalated, or that they have mental health concerns, or that they're insane or crazy. And I think that not only does that like minimize and delegitimize everyone who's coming forward, but especially the harm that it does to folks who already, are struggling with disabilities. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Emily, for bringing up ableism in relation to victim blaming. That was really important. I'm also coming from my own personal experience and context as a Black woman, and what I've learned about the history of colonization and devaluing of Black women's bodies. I feel like for all women of color, specifically Black women, the history of slavery and that real, stripping of humanity. When you strip someone of their humanity, you strip them of their right to bodily autonomy. So I feel like for Black women and also other women of color, it's an interesting experience there's that added layer, that intersectional layer of devaluing, and that intersectional layer of you don't deserve bodily autonomy because you aren't even considered human. So I thought that would bring that up. And I think I agree with Mia, you know, rape culture is rape culture. Women experience sexual violence in every community. So do men and non-binary people. But that when you add in that historical context of you know, especially in the US context, you have a different experience when you add that in. Kind of flustered, sorry everyone. But I wanted to say another great place to access information about the plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women is the BBC podcast, and Murdered. It can be kind of graphic, but it talks a lot more about that idea, like the tribal law and jurisdictional issues when it comes to violence against women.
Nikayla, can you say that that website again? You kind of went in and out there when you.
Okay, yeah, it's by British Canadian. I can't remember the name of the. I don't know if it's BBC Canada. I think that's the name of the people who put it out, but it's called Missing and Murdered. It's a podcast.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Oh,
sorry, was somebody going to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to thank Nikayla for saying that. And I also wanted to bring up, like, just looking at the history of things, like, look at the history of the field of gynecology. That was literally created by experimenting on Black women who were slaves. Like, we don't think about how integrated these things are in our society, but we still have gynecology today, and most people don't know the actual origins. So I think it just speaks to, like, how much education we need on the actual history of colonization and oppression of people of color.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely like a theme with a lot of what we're saying, just because the history, I guess, sort of set the stonework for our dehumanization in today. Like, I feel like Nikayla said very important things that had to be said because our experiences are not like felt the same way, even if like the prerogative might be the same by certain people. But it's just really interesting to me because I feel like there's this constant, I guess, like strain of just like constant like devaluation of like people of color through like history. Like white supremacy has definitely, I feel like, used sexual violence for its own like prerogatives, which I feel like most people don't really talk about sexual assault as like a means to an end rather than the end, because people are like, oh, like, no, they just want to have like sexual satisfaction or gratification, and it's not to like a larger picture. But I feel like what we're all describing, like the disproportionate amount of like Indigenous and Native women and Black women and other women of color, I feel like it really is like evidence that there's something much more insidious going on than just people trying to get sort of like that sexual satisfaction, because why are these bodies being targeted above all else, especially non-binary and trans women as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Let's just take the second to say this right out loud, put it right there. Sexual violence is not about sex, it's about power and control. So yes, thank you all for saying that. Sorry, I think I might have cut somebody off. Go ahead.
No, that was me. You didn't cut me off. I was barely forming a thought, and you gave me time to form it. So, yeah, I think that, like, when I think about like ableism and when I think about other forms of oppression that have been mentioned by my wonderful other members of the panel, it's really like kind of what I've seen in media and in history, is like sometimes we have, I don't know, the spectrum, but we either have like this really over sexualization of people that turns them into objects, and like sometimes we see that like with trans women, like we see like this over sexualization. We see that with women of color, and then also with people with disabilities, we kind of see this like utter like desexualization where they are not allowed to be sexual beings, and therefore they're kind of turned into objects as well. So I think like the end result is the same, and the end result is that like somebody with more power and control with like malicious intent, therefore is feels like they can use other people as objects. Just a thought.
No, it was a good thought. Thank you. So one other resource that I want to throw out there, kind of tagging along with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, is the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. It's nsvanw.org. They have a really great website if you would like to learn more about that. But we were just really talking about historical perspectives, and I want to piggyback off that. So, and talk about the historical perspective and the time that we are in now. So let's take a second just to talk about the format of this panel and why we are doing this without a quote unquote live audience. So we are all under the stay-at-home order. And with most of our normal activities being moved to a digital space, we've been using Zoom for almost everything. And I'm sure most of us have heard about Zoom bombing, where people hack into Zoom meetings and post horrid and oftentimes incredibly offensive things. So I'm interested to hear from the panel, do you think Zoom bombing contributes to rape culture? And if so, how?
I think Zoom bombing sort of weaves itself into rape culture just because it sort of violates people's, like, I guess, personal space and also just like feeling of security. Like if I'm on a Zoom call with like people who I'm like excited to talk to, and then like 80 different people come in just like doing whatever on the screen, I think it's really traumatic just because you think that you're safe in this space. And for me, I feel like no one really told me that there was that risk of that happening. So it was even more of a surprise when it actually did happen. So I think that was very alarming. And I feel like it's sort of, I don't know, like I said, it's sort of like a space violation just because that I didn't ask to see any of these people and I didn't invite them to my space. Moreover, I feel like Zoom has been very like academically centered for my life. So I'm just like, oh, why are these people in my assumed like safety space in school? So that sort of was a lot weirder for me, especially because they could see inside my own living like area and like see me. And that was really alarming just because I was like, oh no, like technology is sort of like, I don't know, like that sense of security being lost is definitely what ties it to like it to rape culture for me, just like that loss.
Yeah, so Zoom bombing happened to me. I was trying to do like a program for women student initiatives, and all of a sudden there were like 50 people in a Zoom room being really violent, showing violent pornographic images, and just overall just being awful. And it was really awful for me. It reminded me of in high school there used to be this thing called chat roulette that my friends who were guys liked being on for some reason, but it was mostly like other teenage boys being really gross and disgusting. And yeah, so I think it's just another iteration of invasion of space, lack of consent, and thinking that it's funny. So the after effects of this happening to me was I was like, I'm gonna infiltrate and figure out why this is happening and do a search on Reddit and find out who are these people and all this stuff. And I was like trying to be investigative and be like, I'm gonna take you all down, which of course I can't, it's the internet, like but what I found was that a lot of this was rooted in trying to be funny and trying to get likes and views, and thinking that it was funny. And I think that really like highlights the violence around making a joke. And like, it's not ever just a joke. It's not ever just humor. It's really rooted in trying to oppress someone and trying to make them feel uncomfortable or violated in some way. And it goes back to that idea of rape culture and it being not about sex, but being about control and fear and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what my perspective is on it. It's just another iteration of what has been happening. And if people find a way to violate you, they will. And that's just illustrates how pervasive rape culture is.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Something that happened to you. That's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that happen, Madison. That's awful. And I think especially it being something like tied to your office and like specifically what you do, for that to show up there, which is already, I think, like what Mia said, like a lot of the school stuff and the activity stuff is meant to be a safer space for people.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of like just makes it even more of a violation for them to choose that venue to do that.
And I think it like I'm the only intercultural specialist that serves specifically women, and so for it to happen to me and none of my other colleagues, I think was really indicative of this is about rape culture. You know, like this is about oppressing women.
Yeah. And to answer your question, Cate, I do think that it is like a symptom of, it's just like another symptom of rape culture. It really, when this started happening and I started hearing about it, it really reminded me of doxing, and that kind of whole phenomenon of, you know, really like publishing people's private information online, really with malicious intent to harm people. And I think sometimes people think like, oh, well, doxing was like it was usually like sometimes people viewed it as retaliatory, but it's a violation, and it doesn't just threaten somebody's like online presence or like their finances, but it like affects people's like workplaces, their home life, and like sometimes your bodily safety of somebody invading your virtual space. And I don't think that like with Zoom bombing, I don't think that that's talked about enough. Like sometimes people are like, oh, well, it's upsetting and it's unexpected, and it's kind of inconvenient for somebody to do that during a meeting or a call. And I'm like, well, it could, you know, if somebody can gain access to that information, it certainly can then like lead to further harm down the road, which is, you know, very frightening. And I'm sure for some that is an intention for why they're choosing to Zoom bomb, to let people know that they have, again, power and control. They can do this. You are not the person in control, they are. And, you know, they can really do whatever they'd like. And I heard one really unpleasant thing, because I was kind of asking about Zoom bombing. And I know somebody told me that like a tactic that they use is actually called ear rape. And it's where they, like, that's what they're calling it. And they're like blasting really loud like music or other like really awful noises. Because, you know, a lot of people have headphones in when we're doing this. And that's like a very visceral way to affect somebody's body. Because there are like minimal ways that Zoom bombing can like immediately affect your body. Of course, it could like put you into like a triggered state. But also like that kind of, I think, like visceral shock of having something just kind of explode in your ears, like that's violent and that's harmful. And so I echo what everyone else has already said about, you know, how it violates our boundaries, especially now at home. I know a lot of people across the board are having to juggle like school and home and work, and having aspects of all of those things in your home. I know, like from my experience as an advocate, you know, sometimes it's not the easiest thing to have all of my work be in my home, because there's not a great separation of kind of the emotional toll of work and then being at home where it's supposed to be a separated, safer space. And so for Zoom bombing to like further violate people's like personal relationships and calls and home space, yeah, I think it's definitely a symptom and a continuation of a lot of the stuff we've seen over the years.
I really love going last because all I have to do is put the cherry on top of the already. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I haven't experienced Zoom bombing. I'm a little scared of it. It's just like everyone said, it's that invasion of privacy. You know, if you are invasion of those personal spaces, especially right now, I doubt a lot of people feel safe. You know, you can't leave your house without being fearful that someone's either going to attack you because you're not wearing a mask, or be xenophobic because they think you have coronavirus, or to be in a Zoom class, like for me, that's been one of my saving graces getting through this, because I know that everyone else is sitting behind their computer screen feeling the same way. And to have those spaces invaded by people who only want to do harm or cause harm it's really discerning, or disconcerting. Yeah, so
yeah. Same. And just one thing that Madison said that I kind of wanted to add on to is like, it seems like it's done for a joke, right? It's supposed to be funny. One of the things that we talk about in bystander intervention training is this concept of the pyramid of violence, and it's essentially something like a joke or a comment or something like that gives a platform for higher levels of violence. So physical violence being like sexual assault or something like that. And you know, I don't think a lot of people tend to think of something like that when they do something for fun or for a joke. But I think that is very important and just needs to be explicitly said. But you know, jokes can be funny, but jokes like that can also be extremely harmful in ways that people might not think about. So.
I would go so far as to say, like, you can call something a joke, but that's just a veiled like thing, you know. It's not really a joke. Like, your intention is not to make me laugh if you're doing it to me. Your intention is to hurt me and do it for yourself.
The only thing calling it a joke proves is that you find it funny. It doesn't prove anything to anyone else.
Yeah, and I think that ends up saying more about you than it does about anything else. So yeah, awesome. So one of the great things about culture is that it can shift, right? So we've seen this in a few examples of culture and public opinion shifting in recent history, and that shift certainly does take time, but it usually starts with awareness of the problem. So what is something that we can do to raise awareness of rape culture?
That's such a hard question. I feel like a lot of it is like, you have to sort of check your friends. Like, I feel like sort of trying to change strangers out of the blue is like a lot harder because they don't really have any stake in why they should listen to you. But I feel like getting your immediate circle in check is definitely one of the more manageable things to do to raise awareness in that, especially because I feel like, you know, your friends or your family are much more invested in your well-being and also somehow have like a semblance of like responsibility to you, and also like you have a responsibility to them. So I feel like it would be a lot easier to raise awareness in your own circles and then sort of hope that it does like a domino effect, because I feel like a lot of the times that universities try to raise awareness is very like disingenuous. I think a lot of the times it usually comes in the form of some sort of online training that says like, don't rape people, and then that's sort of like the end of it. And I feel like a lot of people know that they shouldn't rape people, but those sort of like gray areas of like what actually like counts as rape, or like how does invalidating people's space like translate into consent and other aspects of their lives, I feel like is not touched on. Not to say that I think that you could actually teach all of these nuanced things in an online module, but just that sort of like, I don't think sort of like that a hands-off type of way to raise awareness is necessarily going to be the most effective or efficient way, even if you're reaching a lot of people.
I definitely agree, Mia. And I think one of the frustrating things about working in higher education is I often feel like it's too late. Like a lot of the behaviors and the socialization that has happened to create this rape culture to begin with is already ingrained once you get to college. And so it can be really frustrating when you're a professional in this work and you're trying to advocate and try and dismantle those socialization phenomenons, and you're kind of like, you needed this when you were 4 and 5. Like you needed this a while ago. Like, so I really think like the best way to create like a big shift is comprehensive sex education as early as possible. And I just get frustrated when people are like, oh, we can't talk about that with kids. They're gonna have sex and then get pregnant. Well, they're already doing that, so let's just talk about it so we can try and prevent these things from happening. And who knows, maybe there's research out there that says like that's the best way to do it. I don't know. I don't do this work. It's fine. So that's what I really want to see happen. But I know that starts with me. And so I really try and influence my circle, like Mia said, and I think about my future kids and how I'm going to raise them to be good people and to understand what consent is. And, you know, we really just need to raise good men, in my opinion. Like, if we could do that, that would be great.
I want to add on to something that Maddie said. First of all, yes, there's a ton of research that shows that comprehensive sex ed is fantastic for violence prevention. It's there. Read it. Not for you all, but go out and read it. But also the NSVRC, as part of their Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign, has some materials out on teaching consent at an early age. So if that's something that somebody listening is interested in, the nsvrc.org does have that type of information there available. So thank you, Madison.
Okay, I'm going to get up on my soapbox and I'm going to piggyback off of Madison. So if everybody's ready, I'll do it. I absolutely agree with what everyone has said. I really want to touch on Madison's point of really feeling like, because I've historically worked with adults and I've worked with children as well. When I worked in Arizona, I also worked with children and families who are experiencing sexual violence. And really, working with adults, it often leaves me with the feeling, I think Madison said it really well, of like, I'm too late. Anyways, I've always been an interventionist. I've always been there after something has occurred. So I've never had a strictly 100% prevention-based role to prevent this from ever happening, but that is also a passion of mine. So a lot of times I do feel like I'm too late. I'm only ever responding. It's a lot of times we use this analogy of like, I'm the person pulling people out of the river, but I'm not like further upriver preventing people from falling in, so I don't have to pull them out. But I absolutely, I'm a huge proponent of making sure that kids have access to education and resources, because yes, the research shows that is really, I think, kind of the best intervention that we could be doing at this point. And I believe it was Nikayla earlier who mentioned like, it's not just for like kind of these violations related to sexual violence, it's for everything. So we need to be teaching kids about like consent for everything, not just things as related to sex in the body, but like handling conflict and handling rejection well. And also like educating kids to know also like, I know a popular curriculum that existed, I'm not sure how many years ago, but somebody else may know this. I know a lot of times something that was used to teach kids was like good touch, bad touch. I don't think we have enough of that type of curriculum out for kids to teach that stuff as well, to let them know that like, not only can like you learn how to handle rejection on your own, but you should be able to reject others. You should be able to say no when you want to say no. Because I don't think that that message is often given to kids, and a lot of kids feel pressure to receive affection, and other types of things that make them feel uncomfortable and like their boundaries are being violated, but they don't have the words to explain how they're feeling. They don't know who to tell. And so, yeah, I think that we need a lot of work around this, and I want to specifically talk about a way that we could do that in Ohio. So this is a very concrete thing that everyone can do, is, contact your representatives and talk about House Bill 321. And that is for Aaron's Law. And so Aaron's Law, so right now in Ohio, schools are not required to instruct students on sexual violence prevention or sexual abuse. Aaron's Law would follow the trend in the country. There are 37 other states that have passed Aaron's Law. Ohio is not one of them yet. It's up right now. It's being reviewed. It would require all Ohio school districts, basically like all schools in Ohio, to provide annual age-appropriate instruction on child sexual abuse prevention for, like, I think it's K through 6. And it would require many other levels of instruction, like for grades 7 through 12. It would also like provide free curriculum to these schools and give them aid to figure out how to develop their programs, and really just like incorporate all of this training for folks who are working in schools, so they feel prepared and they know how to do this and they know how to support kids. And I think that's so important right now, because right now a lot of kids are at home and a lot of kids are experiencing child sexual abuse, and they're not learning, like I said, there's this great lack of consent education. And so when eventually things go back to normal and we have all of these kids coming back to school, there may have very well been a dramatic increase in how many kids have experienced sexual violence. So we want them to go to school and have the support and education and resources they need to learn about, sexual abuse prevention, which will include consent education, and where they can find support and who they can talk to. So this is me stepping off my soapbox. That's House Bill 321, Aaron's Law. I just think it's a really great initiative, and it really is like a concrete thing that any folks who are in Ohio that are watching this can like call up their representative and let them know that they support Aaron's Law, to get this ball rolling, to raise awareness about the issue of child sexual abuse and the need for education around consent.
Good soapbox. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great soapbox. Thanks, Emily. The first thing that makes me think of really great points about, we should be teaching not only kids to respect no, but to be able to say no. It makes me think about kids who are forced to kiss a relative or hug a relative, stuff like that. It seems so innocent, but it can become so insidious. Someone's taught adults are good, you should listen to what they say. Well, adults are sometimes the worst people in a child's life for these issues. So thank you for covering all of that. Another thing I wanted to bring up that Mia kind of talked about is, everyone talked about that idea of it's too late. That's really frustrating. When I was a relationship education and violence prevention ambassador under Cate, actually, I was teaching classes on sexual consent for first-year students here at Ohio State. And one thing that I and the other ambassadors talked about a lot was that you're not going to change everyone's mind. Like you said, like someone said, a lot of people have these ideas that they've already developed. They're 18 to 20 years old. They've already developed their ideas, and they're somewhat finished developing their morals and all that kind of stuff. But there's always those people who you can watch who sit in the middle of the road. They either didn't know what sexual consent was, they've never used it, it's not that they have malicious intent, they're just so uninformed that they might make these mistakes and to disrespect someone's bodily autonomy. And those are the people that I get excited about, because that means that you're doing something, right? You're making someone think, oh, like if that person had X amount of drinks, they probably can't consent right now, or they cannot consent right now. And that was one of the most rewarding parts of it. So, you know, that you have to take the little victories when you know someone has been impacted by what you had to tell them. But on the other hand, you know, comprehensive sex education would, I feel like, solve a lot of the problems that we see once people get to college, or before or after that.
Yeah, thank you all. I certainly agree. I get excited about being able to reach those people who maybe, because we don't have comprehensive sex ed, have never talked about consent, or maybe this is the first time that we see them in Buckeye Cares, the first time that they've ever actually had a conversation about sex out loud. So I agree that is exciting for me too.
I think it's so important on college campuses, I think, because of what a lot of people have said, especially Nikayla, about all of the issues that exist on college campuses. And like a lot of people are like having sex for the first time, getting into relationships for the first time, like getting any kind of education about relationships and sex for the first time. And also like there are these added substances, you know, alcohol and drugs that are often added into the mix. And people, it's really hard to know, I think, when you've had no education. And a lot of times, like we see like young adults get to college and they've had really poor modeling as well at home of like what healthy sex and healthy relationships look like. I think all of that like combines into like this like ticking time bomb sometimes. So yeah, I think that college education and prevention is so essential and important. And if we can just up the education for all of the other age groups and make it really comprehensive, we'll knock out a lot of these problems.
I'm a huge proponent of that. That would certainly make my life much less stressful. So this is actually a really good segue. We've been talking about consent, and like Nikayla had said, you know, one widely used prevention strategy is teaching about consent. And you know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We are still in April. And the theme for SAM for the last 2 years has been I Ask, which uplifts the importance of consent. And something that I've really appreciated about the focus on consent is that it starts to normalize and really create a culture of consent. So that's kind of where I want to, you know, spend the rest of our time talking. And my first question for you about that is, how would you define a consent culture?
I think I would define a consent culture. I don't really know how I would define a consent culture, just because it's such a, I guess I feel like it feels very far off from where we are right now. So it's really hard for me to like figure out what exactly I would want my ideal consent culture to look like. But I think that what we talked about earlier is very close to what I'm looking for, sort of like early childhood intervention with education, but also I guess a general culture where just like bodily autonomy is respected in a way that is meaningful. Just because I feel like consent culture is, to me, like I've said, I feel like it's really hard to nail down exactly what I want to see, just because it seems so far from where we are. But I think that what we talked about is really, at least like the most concrete ways that I can think of this working out. But yeah, I wish I had more to say, but I feel like this question's a little hard for me, so I'm gonna pass it to Maddie.
Yeah, it's definitely, when you're working from a deficit point, it's really hard to imagine what the ideal would look like, right? And that's what we're working from right now. We're at a deficit. Like, things are not good. And we can compare them to historically. Like, has it gotten better In some ways, maybe yes, in other ways, maybe not. So I think like at the core of consent culture, it's exactly what you said, Mia. It's bodily autonomy. It's the right to self-determination and the right to make your own decisions and to have choice and to have a lack of, to eliminate the idea of power and oppression in this conversation. And so I think that it's about humanism, really, like seeing each other as humans and seeing each other as being able to have control over our own selves and not feeling like that control can be taken away at any time.
I agree. I agree, and I think it's so hard to think, I think like Maddie said, it's so hard to think about something that doesn't quite exist yet, something that we haven't fully actualized yet. It's so hard to be like, I'm sure like if I had a ton of time and it was my sole job to think of what a consent culture would look like, I could create something amazing, but not by myself because it wouldn't happen in a vacuum. But I don't know, when I think about consent and everything, I think really about communication and respect. I don't think you can have consent if you don't have some communication. There has to be communication. It doesn't have to be, this long drawn out conversation that everyone thinks of when they think of communication. Sometimes when I say communication, people go, oh, I'm not having like a 2-hour discussion every time. That's okay. But I do think, you need to be interacting with any kind of future or current partner. And you do need to respect what they're communicating to you at all times. I think a lot of that, like when I envision consent culture, it's also hard for me to envision it because I can't quite envision consent culture with all of the other like ills of our society existing as well. Like I can't imagine consent culture with like racism still running rampant, all other forms of oppression running rampant. So it's kind of like, it's equally hard for me to think of because I think like I want all of these things to be gone because unless they're all gone, we can't really have consent for all things. And then my mind further spirals into like, how do I get rid of all of these things? And I don't have a soapbox ready for that yet, but that would be like me giving my talk at Oxford when I'm much further down the line in my career and I'm renowned in the world. But yeah, I think that's part of the difficulty I have in like defining consent culture. I do know that we can't have it when we have all of these other forms of oppression, and I know that we need to up our ability to communicate and respect what people are communicating to us.
I hugely want to reiterate that communication piece. And another thing that I think of to go along with that idea of like consent and the way that we live right now are just not synonymous, is the idea that sex is taboo and that it shouldn't be talked about in any space, or that it's dirty, or that if you're talking about it, that means you're having, I don't know, all these moral implications that people put onto sex that disallow people from talking about it comfortably. And if we had a more open culture to say sex isn't bad, it's part of life, it's a healthy part of life, and whether you do it or don't do it, you have to be able to talk about it with people. If we could get to that point, things would be drastically different, in my opinion. But like everyone said, I can't conceptualize something that is so antithetical to everything that is ingrained in our oppressive society.
Yeah, I'm just glad that all three of you could like say something that was much more elegant than like what I said, but I just want to like reiterate, I really agree with all of what you're saying. Nikayla, what you mentioned, like the moral sort of like signaling about sex sort of reminded me, I don't know if any of you guys have watched this Netflix like new game show. I have a lot of like free time on my hands now that I'm stuck in quarantine. But I watched it last night. It was called Too Hot to Handle. And basically like all of these people are just like on this island, like they think they're gonna have like, I guess like summer, and then plot twist, like the game, like, oh, you can't have sex. For like a prize, like a cash prize of $100,000. But what's interesting to me about this game show is just that it was kept on like moral signaling about sex, like, oh, you can't have a real relationship with just sex, like, oh, you have to have a deeper relationship. And I think it was really interesting, just like the moral signaling that was giving, like, oh, like sex isn't important in a real relationship. And I was like, I'm not gonna say sex isn't important. It was just like a very interesting like idea of a game show. And it sort of, I don't know, I feel like there was a lot of like different aspects of these sort of like signaling to like they're trying to counter like hookup culture, but also simultaneously reinforcing like morals about like why you should be sexual, or like who you should be sexual with, when you should be sexual. And I don't know, I feel like in my consent like culture utopia, we wouldn't need game shows to tell us what is morally right or wrong. And I definitely really want to reiterate what Emily was saying about communication. I feel like it's always so annoying sometimes when people just can't talk about it, because I feel like a lot of relationship problems at their core are communication issues. And if people could just talk to each other or felt comfortable enough to talk to each other, a lot of them would be solved relatively easier than what they are now, just like my experience with having a lot of friends who are in relationships. But that's sort of like my end tail of this question.
I think it's really interesting you brought up that game show. The plot twist is even deeper. You can't touch at all. They're not supposed to touch each other, not supposed to kiss or hug. And then people are supposed to watch and just be like, oh my gosh, look at them. They've got so much control. And I'm like, well, why can't people be sexual beings and still win the money?
That's what I would say. Also, it's kind of weird because they have this robot that always like is watching you, like or not be sexual. So like it's sort of like a Big Brother dystopia of just like they're watching your every sexual move. And if you do something, you lose money. Like you lose $3,000 if you kiss someone. Like it's a wild game show. It's a problematic fave. Let's bring it all back to that. Yeah.
I think it's so, well, we kind of didn't talk about this before, but our society is so obsessed with knowing what other people are doing. Like we love reality TV. We want to see into the deepest recesses of people's lives because we're intrigued by it. And that's a human emotion that we can't just ignore. But if we could just talk about it first, if we could say, do you want people to, if you're a celebrity, follow you around and try to break into your house or all that kind of stuff? Like it goes along with that idea of consent culture. We just don't have it.
Yeah. And when I think of, this is so great because it makes me think of other things. And like when I think of like our society as it is now and like what it could look like with consent culture, I'm like, for some reason, Mia, you made me think of like sex sells and how like we often like try to make things sexy or sexual for like capitalist gain. And that's really harmful too. I think it feeds into like a lot of really harmful ideas about like people's bodies and what they're used for, and like who's sexy and who's not, and who's deserving of like sexual attraction and who's not. And again, I think it feeds into that thing that I mentioned earlier about like this over sexualized images that, you know, we're like, well, I can just buy this and do whatever I want with it. And it doesn't matter who that person is. Like I can use it for my own purposes. I own it. I control it. Or like we desexualize people who are sexual beings. Like everyone's a sexual being. And we kind of deny them from having sexual experience, or they experience sexual violence at higher rates because people think they can do whatever they want and kind of, like victimize and control and oppress people. So that's getting rid of those things, like getting rid of like this need to sexualize everything for some sort of profit. I think would be a key thing to take out of, so we can start talking more about consent and healthy sex.
Yeah, I love that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, I think it goes back to like that consumption of media and like what are we consuming visually or audibly, and I really think about like the culture of porn and what people are learning from porn and that sort of thing, and like
more importantly what they're not learning from
what they're
porn.
not learning. Yes, exactly. Or like the misinformation, like if I am listening to a woman like in porn and I'm like, she's in pain right now, like period, and to a man they don't know that that's so normalized. They see it as like, oh, like that's what I'm supposed to do, and then it reinforces this cycle of violence and like pain and fear and control and all of this stuff. So I just wanted to add that, like, we could probably have like a whole nother discussion on just porn, but
Oh yeah, just to add also, like, I feel like it's so like disappointing too, because like when you get like I know that for one of my classes we talked about like ethical porn and just like how like workers are paid more and actually fairly, and then how like they distribute it is also more equitable to their workers and to their viewers, and how they're focusing more on like not just the male gaze but other people's gazes as well, including non-binary. But just like it's so like discouraging sometimes too, because in order to be like ethically like source porn, there's usually like a paywall because they have to pay their people, and it's not always accessible. So I guess adding on to like what my consent culture would be is like a more easier way to access like porn as a way to like, I don't know, like more educational porn, not just like, I don't know, male gaze porn, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm not entirely sure if that's like the best way to put it, but just more access to better porn, I guess.
I get what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
I hear you. Yeah. Cool. So actually that's a really good jumping off point for the last question that I have for you all, and that's, how do we get there? How do we get to consent culture? And how do we get to a culture where consent is normalized and practiced every time and not just outside of sexual experiences?
I think we sort of talked about this a lot. I feel like we've been talking about like children and their potential to be like sort of this next like vanguard of consent like culture like pillars, and I feel like that's pretty true, but I also feel like in order to do that we also have to work on like the people that we have right now, and definitely like actions like what Emily was saying about the House bill or Senate bill. Yes, I was trying to remember the numbers, but then they just disappeared from my mind. And sort of that early education for children, especially like comprehensive sex ed, but also banning the fact that people can have not scientifically accurate sex ed. Like, I don't think that should be allowed. And there are states that still allow not scientifically based sex ed. So that's, I think, definitely a large problem of just sort of like this constant misinformation being touted as fact, or as valuable as actual facts. So I think how we get there is definitely self-reflection, but also being willing to call out and call in people that we really need to hear us, because without calling in people that we need to hear us, I don't think like any of us like five have the capabilities to change like the US's culture. But if we pull in more people, or if we influence one person that has connection to other people, I think it would be a lot easier. Like if celebrities were much more forthcoming with like, hey, like maybe this, like sort of like using media as like a way to push this instead of like other insidious ideas, I feel like would be a lot more beneficial. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm just going to hit on the education aspect. Again, for kids and children, as well as parents and adults and everything, every age, everyone should have more education, I think. And with that, I think there's a dismantling of misinformation, and a dismantling of the socialization of the taboo nature of like, oh, we can't talk about that, or brushing things aside. So I think that's at the core of it. And I hope we can get there. I think that there are people pushing for it. I think it's hard, but it's definitely necessary.
Yeah, I'll just echo that education is extremely important. I know I've already talked about that. I just think I really think it's really important that we're teaching people how to handle rejection and also like be able to verbalize consent and like what that looks like. I think it's important that we give folks concrete examples and teach that it's okay. Both things are okay. And I absolutely think that, you know, being willing to be a champion of something like this is an excellent first step, and it doesn't need to be, you know, like you're your own mini activist walking around and screaming at people, which I know is a lot of people's like view of how that goes, often inaccurate. But like even on college campuses, like being willing to be the person like in your peer group, in your friend group, who like is a safe space for people to come talk to and ask questions, that's incredibly powerful. And when you don't know the answer to something, like again, not spreading misinformation, but being like, I don't know the answer to that. Like, let's see how we can find that answer. I think that's incredibly powerful too, to like, I think especially like in the college like culture, campus culture, like going to your friend and being vulnerable and asking like a vulnerable question isn't the easiest thing to do, and a lot of times it's like not very supported. But I think like being willing to have those relationships with folks and talk about these things and like be a champion of like talking about consent and like calling in and calling out when you see calling in versus calling out when you see something happening that shouldn't be happening, or when you hear something that's been said that is untrue. I think those are really important things. And even like taking it a step further, like getting involved with a wellness center and becoming like a relationship, like, yeah, becoming like volunteering for causes, you know, like I think wellness center has opportunities, Sarnco has opportunities, and also like being willing to support survivors and like stop some of that victim blaming and that minimizing and that judgment that goes around. I think those are all really important points.
Yeah, fantastic, everyone. Something we didn't touch on a lot, but obviously all of us know about and are working towards, is holding institutions accountable. I think, you know, we all have our individual actions we can do to influence the people around us and to change the culture that we're existing in. But like, an institution has so much power to influence lots of people. So one of my participants in my study talked about, she wishes that the university put their money where their mouth was. So that idea of like, if an institution values the bodily autonomy of their employees or their students or whatever it is, whatever title you want to give them, if they value those things, then they will not only put effort and action into it, but also funding. And, you know, we live in a capitalist society, that matters. So yeah, just when you are researching an institution or an organization that you want to become a part of, see where their funding goes, see where they're putting their philanthropy efforts, and just calling out what you see that's wrong.
I really like Kyla's point. I feel like just being a student in a university, it's been really challenging because there's so many things as a student. You're like, oh, you have access to all of these things, like you'll definitely be able to use them. And when you have 60,000 or even 70,000 people on a campus, it is really hard for those resources to be distributed equally and also just like distributed period, because there are a lot of demand for them. And I almost wish that universities wouldn't promise what they couldn't provide, just because it does give students, and I think a lot of people, false hope that they are secure in these spaces. And when they don't get that support, I feel like it's even more of a betrayal. And I would either really want them to put their money where their mouth is, because I really have a very large problem with institutions not doing that, just because there has been like such detrimental effects on students' well-being because of that broken promise. And it is a broken promise, because universities often say, you'll be safe here, like we have all these resources, like look at this new building we built, look at this new clock tower we have, but where are all of the therapists and like all of the things that students are actually asking for? So yeah, definitely like underline, highlight, italicize everything that Nikayla said.
And I would also say like, I really like that Mia mentioned like equal distribution of resources, because that often doesn't happen, but also like equitable distribution and like allocation of resources and planning for that. I think like people with different identities of backgrounds and lived experiences do require different forms of support and education and resources. And everyone has a right to have access to the support of their choosing that's like tailored to their identity. And I don't think that exists a lot, actually, at all, unfortunately, is the reality. And I think that the more that can be provided for, I think it just results in better education and engagement.
Yeah, definitely second that. It's not completely related to developing consent culture, but another thing from my research was what Mia said, the idea that survivors need resources, but they can't access them. A lot of people mentioned, I wanted to get therapy at CCS, and this is obviously an intervention, not prevention, but I wanted to get therapy at CCS, but they had a wait list, or I wanted to get therapy, or I wanted to get services here, but I found out they're a mandatory reporter. It's really, understanding all of the barriers to a student's well-being that a university is perpetuating, identifying them, or a system is perpetuating, and saying, okay, how do we attack this one thing? Because we know that this is keeping people from succeeding, whether it's perpetuating rape culture and allowing people to assault more people, or leaving survivors in the dust and not giving them the support that they need.
So this actually, this conversation that we have actually goes really, really well into a question that we received from the quote unquote audience that I want to pose to you all. So this person asks, where in the realm of higher education can we improve in supporting students on campus that have been victims of rape and sexual assault? I think we're kind of already talking about that, but let's go a little bit more into that, if anybody has any thoughts.
Can you read the question?
Yes, I can. Where in the realm of higher education can we improve in supporting students on campus that have been victims of rape and sexual assault?
So resources for supporting offenders? Is that okay?
Oh no, the victim survivors. So what more? I think that's a valid answer too. Is
okay. Yeah, sorry, I thought I heard the word offend and I was like, I don't know where in the sentence that.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I think that's a really hard question, because I don't know exactly how all of higher ed works, and also the politics of who's in charge and who reports to who. I feel like what we've been talking about, sort of funding more resources for students through like higher ed opportunities like college, like getting them like therapy or getting them all these other support systems that they might not have had access to before, would be really important. I also think we should reevaluate policies that concern mandated reporting, because I feel like a lot of students, not to say that mandating reporting is like inherently bad or wrong, but just to say that I feel like there are lots of complications that go along with mandated reporting, and also providing students with support and care, because I feel like students wouldn't, go tell someone that they don't really know something very traumatic happening to them. They would go to the person that they feel closest to. But if the person they feel closest to is a mandated reporter, that becomes another opportunity for them to either feel betrayed or also like a deterrent to actually express how they felt or what happened to them. And I feel like it's really tricky sometimes because some people don't know that they're mandated reporters, or sometimes people don't report when they should have. Like, there's a lot of gray areas with it, and I feel like higher ed needs to do a better job with dealing with the nuances of mandated reporting and how it might impact students and not just liability on campus.
Thank you, Mia. I think that's really, really important to say. I think this question really ties into our like dream big question. OSU is its own community. We have our own zip code. Like, we are like a society. And so, like, if we're trying to imagine a consent culture, why not start with us? Like, why not start with our sphere of influence? And I really think like there's a lot of areas that could be improved. I think a lot of policies at OSU in general have a trickle down effect, whatever is said at the top is filtered through the different layers, through student life and then the college academic side and ODI and all Office of Diversity and Inclusion and all of these entities. And it's almost like a game of telephone in many ways of like, what's happening? Are we all on the same page? The answer is no. And so I really think like it starts at the top, but it also starts like everywhere. It starts with individuals and it starts with the departments and building that culture of consent and restorative justice, right? And I think like you're exactly right, Mia, like funding could definitely be improved, especially the allocation of equitable resources. One thing I would love to see is Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies has a very comprehensive sex ed training, and it's not accessible to all of our students. Like, I would love for that program to be mandated for all students, like either in orientation or part of the first year success series. I think that would be so valuable in deconstructing that socialization and getting them like right off the bat as soon as they get to campus or as soon as they are enrolled at OSU or whatever may happen in our current state. But just getting them early and like establishing like OSU is a place of consent culture. Like, we don't tolerate any violation or variation from that. I think that would be my dream big, like phenomenal response.
I love that you said that, we don't tolerate this. This is not acceptable here, because it's huge in
right
shifting a culture. So yeah, I love that. Retweet on that so many times.
I mean, I feel like many of the most recent things have been things that OSU has been like very PR about, like, we have to maintain our image and just like, let's make this as quiet as possible, and maybe we'll put out a few things, but we're going to try and minimize the exposure of whatever is happening, which has predominantly been associated with our athletic department in recent times.
Yeah, thank you, Madison.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I would say, thinking of my dream big for OSU, I'm trying to think of like from my experience as a campus advocate and what I've seen. I really can't underscore how like impressed by and how much like I value the students that I get to work with, like the students in Take Back the Night and It's On Us. I really think that those are such important avenues on campus for folks to go to and like find community and support and resources and like be part of a change. I really can't underscore the value of that. And I think that the, you know, the university could be doing a better job of that, of like supporting those orgs, and allowing for more opportunities for students to like organize and, you know, just have resources for them to be able to do more with that, like with those activities. Because I think it's so important, and I related to that with what you do, Cate. I think that peer support is so important. And I love that the Wellness Center is chock full of peer support, because I really do think it is an excellent model. I think that kind of intervention from a peer, while, you know, I think sometimes in the advocacy realm, it's had issues on other campuses. I don't think it means that it's not something that we can try to make better and improve. I would love to see peer advocates on campus. I think that would be, if it's done right and it's done with enough resources and attention and intention, I think that it could be a really successful intervention model. Like involving more students, more people from the community in the advocacy work would be fantastic, and to see support from the university on that would be great. I also just think like a lot of what we've been talking about is like transparency. And I know a lot of times people feel like, oh, there's this big institution and I never know what's going on. Like, you know, somebody's making decisions at the top or on the side, and it's not making it to the other side or down to the bottom. Or like a decision has been made and it kind of isn't more of like a power over move. I feel like it's kind of like, this decision has been made, here's the decision. And it's not necessarily like, again, involving these like really great organizations or like individuals who have things to say, have things to input. And so like from my role of supporting survivors, you know, I'd love to see like more decisions made with the input of survivors who have been impacted on campus, and with the input of like allies who support survivors that have been impacted on campus. I think that involving those voices is so important. I'd also just like love to see a campus-wide, like regular opportunity for people to gather and communicate. Because I think that so much like misinformation and like bad feelings just kind of fester when like the institution isn't communicating with the community. And a lot of times it's like this big bad institution, and then there are like a lot of really great individuals who may be working for that institution and trying really hard, but there just aren't a lot of opportunities to connect and communicate about it. And that's kind of like my view somewhat as like an outside insider. Like I don't work for the university, but I work at the university and I work with the university. So that's kind of what I've seen as like, I think that there are a lot of great people who want to work for the university that like are really engaged and want to help. And then there's like the community itself, and there just isn't a lot of opportunity for folks to like really connect and like listen and like hear each other. And then also with that is like the university's responsibility to then act with that information. Because it's great to like gather and talk and communicate, but without action and commitment, it doesn't amount to a whole lot.
Yeah.
I think open communication is very important with that too. Mm-hmm. But also, yeah, I agree. I would love to see a peer advocate program somewhere. I think that would be a great idea. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Nikayla, I think I kind of sort of cut you off. Sorry about that.
All good. I was going to say the same thing that you said, basically. Yeah. Knowing that most survivors don't report to officials of any kind, they most of the time are reporting or sharing their experiences with friends or peers. Peer advocacy seems like a perfect avenue. So I definitely want to reiterate everything that people said about that. And so this is a perfect question for me. I really wanted to answer this one because this is basically what I've been doing for the last 2 years is trying to understand, I mean, on a small scale, because I'm only one person, how are survivors receiving support from the university? Are they actually receiving that support? Is it adequate? All that kind of stuff. And some big themes came out of what I did. I found out a lot of survivors And when I say a lot, I had a sample size of 19. So obviously I couldn't interview every survivor that's ever walked on OSU's campus, but a lot of them didn't have any knowledge of what was available to them. They really didn't have any knowledge of what resources were available, how to report, where to go, who was a mandatory reporter, all that kind of stuff. And it was really surprising to me because I'm so engaged in this work as a peer leader or as a student leader with a student org. So they didn't have a lot of information, and that's one of the biggest recommendations they had was we need to be told what's available to us and how it works, what the processes are like earlier on, so that maybe when they experience sexual violence or they know someone who does, they have those resources on hand. I actually advertised my study in bathroom stalls, and a lot of people talked about that and said that was really, really good for them because they felt comfortable taking a slip of paper because it was in a private space. Yeah, so more information, that was like the biggest thing that survivors identified, more access to information, more comprehensive information, and so that people aren't left, slipping through the cracks. And I had another thought, but it's kind of escaping my mind now. So if anyone has anything they want to say.
Yeah, definitely want to highlight what oh my God, I almost Cariello said. I feel like it's really important to provide like a lot of support for survivors on campus, but I also wish that, I guess like my hope ideal world is that universities, like what we were talking about, are held accountable, especially at least like the work that I've done has predominantly surrounded by like the Strauss survivors here at OSU's campus, and they're pushing for a House Bill 249 to make sure that the university is held accountable for its negligence of just completely ignoring all of their complaints, even if they did follow all of the protocols that they had to and were expected to years before. So I feel like a lot of the time, it's like not only giving all of the survivors and like people the resources they need before anything happens, but also making sure that those are actually acted on and not just filed away as like, oh, it happened, like, okay, you're put in like a queue, but to actually act on those. Because I feel like, at least from my like personal understandings with a lot of survivors I've talked to with my work, is that not many people find the university as a source of comfort or support, even though the university sort of tries to say that it is. And I feel like the fact that survivors of Dr. Strauss had to constantly tell their story to just get this sort of bill on the table, and also having to have current like OSU people listen to their testimony over and over is really traumatic. And the fact that the university sort of made this harm and continues to perpetuate this harm by not actually providing support that's needed is sort of evident of how much needs to change still. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot that the university could do in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have another question come in from our audience that I want to give a little bit of space for, and then I'll let you all say your last thoughts if you have any, and then we'll sign off here, okay? So last question is, what are things that we as a society should do to support victims of rape and sexual assault?
Believe them. Sorry, I had to say it out there.
Love it.
Yeah, I feel like the biggest thing that we can do is just believe them and not interrogate them. Like, we don't need to know what all the details of their experiences. We don't need to know exactly what they were wearing or why they were there. We just need to believe that it happened, because if we don't, I feel like a lot of survivors sort of suffer in silence, because if they think that no one will believe them, it gets so much worse for them.
I definitely agree. Believing survivors is key and at the core of any dismantling that we can do. Yeah, I would also say, like, I think it's also important to not protect protect offenders, like, at the detriment of survivors. Like, I think there's a lot of confusion and misinformation about false reporting and that sort of thing. And so I really think that that's important to address. Like, I believe this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this statistic is like less than 2% of reports are false, quote unquote. And so I think that's really important, is especially when we think about some of the policies or laws that have been proposed by the Department of Education, and the restructuring or adjusting of Title IX to include basically forcing survivors to confront their offenders in person or in any way, is very alarming to me. And I think anything we can do to have evidence-based practices and policies is very, very important.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, as usual. I think it's incredibly important that survivors receive like a response that's full of like listening and believing. A lot of research shows that our first interaction with a survivor when they disclose will heavily impact what steps they take next, and if they are ever going to talk to another person or seek support later on. So it's incredibly important that we listen and believe first. I think like reassuring survivors that we believe them, and that what happened to them isn't their fault is incredibly important too. A large part of rape culture is this idea that we can somehow deserve sexual violence, or that we can cause it. Nobody is ever at fault for sexual violence except for the perpetrator. The survivor does not ever cause or deserve sexual assault. There's nothing that anybody can do to deserve that. Just, I think, and simply put, no action excuses a person hurting someone else. And I think, you know, validating survivors, like validating what they're feeling and what they're going through, and like letting them know that like trauma is real and trauma is complex and varied. And there are a lot of common responses to trauma, but they aren't an absolute roadmap to how everyone's going to feel and respond. And that a lot of these, you know, like big problems that may come up, like if you've had a friend who's experienced sexual violence and they're having emotional outbursts, or they're having difficulty with their relationships, those are common trauma responses. And it's not necessarily that this person is being difficult or angry or disagreeable. It's you know, they may be having a trauma response on top of everything else in life that they're dealing with, because we all have stress and other areas of trauma that we're working through. So I think like we can like express admiration for like how resilient they are going through with this. I think that's always something I encourage people to offer survivors. And I always like, coming from the perspective of like respecting survivor autonomy as well, is like checking in and asking like, how do you want to be supported? Like, how can I support you? And not assuming, because a lot of times like we want to jump in and fix and make things right when we really can't. And it's just not a realistic goal. I heard somebody describe that, you know, like being a good ally or supporter to survivors, like you're not the hero in the cape. You're kind of like the sidekick that's sometimes there. Like you're popping in and out, you're helping with a task, you're helping with a goal, you're being there for them, but you're by no means are you the hero. And a lot of times I think when we're talking about supporting people in that way, people are like, okay, I'm gonna do everything, I'm gonna take that burden on, but it's not realistic, and it just sets up for like poor boundaries, further like boundary violations, things like that. Just like letting survivors make their own choices, even if it's stuff we don't agree with. Because I think, like we've said, like sometimes survivors are like, I don't want to report to anybody, I don't want evidence collected, I don't want to talk to the police, I don't want to talk to the school. Sometimes it may feel very important to us to be like, but you have to call the police, but you have to get evidence collected. because of some messaging that we've received or some value that we hold. But at the end of the day, we're not that person. And, you know, each person is the expert in their own lives. They deserve to be able to make their own choices. And I think the only other thing is like being aware. Like there are lots of do's and don'ts, but being self-aware and like, again, like knowing how you can, like being self-aware and honest about how you can show up for others, and like learning about like systemic oppression and how that affects survivors, and like recognizing trauma and its impact on survivors. Like I think being aware of all of that and seeking out those resources are all important. Like you don't have to be an expert. There's this quote I really like that I'm gonna try and remember. It's like trauma recovery doesn't come from like a specific tool or like a specific tool set, but it's like countless interactions with like kind, loving, like trustworthy, supportive people. And I really like that, because there are lots of like things, like I could go through like a whole presentation, and I do one about supporting survivors and all the things that you can do or not do. But I really think like coming from that place of like being a trustworthy, calm person that you can be like relied on is so important, and to be consistent and to have that countless interaction. And I know the person who said that, because I don't want anyone to think those are my words, but it's Louise Godbold, and she is a survivor of Harvey Weinstein and an executive director of an amazing company that does trauma-informed training and tools. So those are her words that I think I butchered a little bit, but the intent was there.
We got the idea. Yeah, everything that everyone said was fantastic. And I liked how you talked about educating yourself. No one's going to be an expert on how to support survivors, but reading books and articles and just keeping up to date is important if you really want to be an advocate with survivors. Speaking of books, I've been reading this book called We Believe You. It's Survivors of Campus Sexual Assault Speak Out. And it features two survivors who were in the hunting ground, which is a really great documentary about college sexual assault. And I wanted to read this quote because I thought it kind of summed up what we were talking about. Believing survivors is a type of radical everyday activism, since we live in a society that suggests that you do completely the opposite. So I just want to share that.
I love that. That was a good quote.
And if anybody wants that book, you can come get it at Sarnco for free. I'll literally hand it out to just about anybody who wants it. Okay. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I want to wrap up here, but also want to leave the floor open for you all. Does anybody have any last thoughts that they would like to share?
I was just going to say my thesis will be available on the Knowledge Bank May 5th. My last name's Hawkins, Hawkins, if you want to look it up.
We'll definitely be checking that out. Thank you. I'm excited to read it.
The only thing I would like to say is if anyone wants to get involved with Take Back the Night, definitely reach out to us. You can either reach out to me through my OSU email, cariello.2@osu.edu, so CARIELLO.2, or you could follow us on Instagram at Take Back the Night OSU, and you can DM us, and we'll get back to you really soon. So yeah.
Cool, thank you.
I'll just say, if anybody does ever need to speak to an advocate, Sarnco does have a 24/7 line. Our number is 614-267-7020. That also exists on a lot of OSU, sorry, my mind is blanking, a lot of areas of OSU. So it's in the app. I'm sure it's on the wellness page somewhere. It's definitely on Title IX and the Office of Institutional Equities page. And that line is staffed 24/7 with advocates like me who are ready to talk. And also for campus specific, if anybody has any questions or if you want that book or would like to get connected to an advocate, my email is Emily, EMILY.Sarnco, SARNCO @ohiohealth.com.
I just wanted to share some sex positivity, like if you're a survivor, anybody, like you're allowed to be a sexual being. And if you are looking for resources, there's a really cool website called omgyes.com, and it's literally just like hundreds of videos about pleasure, really focused on women. I don't think that's talked enough amongst women to engage with ourselves and find out what makes us feel good. And then I just wanted to end and say, like, if you are a survivor listening, I believe you, we believe you, and you are loved. And
yeah, thank you for that. That was going to be what I was going to say too. So yes, we believe you. If it feels like nobody else does, just know that we do. And if you would like to be connected to an advocate, please reach out to Emily. Other things that I just wanted to say, if you're interested in learning a little bit more, reading more about rape culture, there's 2 books that I recommend. One is Rape Culture on Campus. It's fairly academic, but really, truly interesting. And another one is What We Talk About When We Talk About Rape. Also very interesting. That's written by a survivor, so I highly recommend that. But with that, I want to say thank you to everybody who is listening. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions or have any thoughts, please feel free to reach out. And with that, we're going to log off, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.